Welcome, discoverers! From the depths of the rainforest to the heart of bustling cities, invisible threats are crossing the species line. Viruses, bacteria, and parasites, once confined to animals, are now finding new hosts. Us.
Sounds like the start of a dystopian thriller. The latest season of, The Last of Us, attacked by a fungus and turned into a zombie. Woohoo!
Yeah, that's when I tuned out, honestly. But don't tune out of this episode, because there is a lot of work going into investigating zoonotic diseases, such as tuberculosis, rabies, and bird flu.
Okay, zoonotic diseases and not zombies are what matters in this episode of Discovery Matters, brought to you by the fun people at Cytiva. Let's get into it.
I'm unusual because I'm a veterinarian who spends a little bit of time in the vet school and a lot of time in the Department of Medicine.
To guide us through zoonotic disease, what they are, and why we pay attention to them, we have Clare Bryant.
So I'm particularly interested in the immune system and particularly trying to understand what are called zoonotic pathogens. So that's pathogens that are in animals, either they cause disease or quite often they hide, how they then move and spill over from animals into humans. And when they go into humans, they cause disease. So I'm really fascinated by how a pathogen can hide in one animal and cause a disease in a human, and whether or not there are aspects of the immune system that help that to happen, and can we leverage that?
It's fascinating and a bit unsettling how something can be harmless in one species and devastating in another.
Clare was drawn to this cross-specialism in an earlier career path to become a veterinarian. And then
I was really gripped by the excitement of science and trying to understand how things happen at a molecular level. And I did my veterinary degree, and I realised very quickly that I really couldn't get to grips with those questions unless I specialised in research. I then went to work in a Nobel laureate's lab, actually, in London. That was really exciting, and I really started to think about, let's think about the fundamental science here, and let's start to understand what happens in people. Why is it different in animals? What's really happened that's very exciting recently is for years and years and years I could hardly do any research in cells from any animal. And then suddenly CRISPR-Cas9, which is an incredible technology for gene editing, now I can say, okay, if this gene is important, if I take it out of humans, does that mean I don't get infection anymore? Or if I put a gene back into a bird, does that mean it suddenly becomes inflamed in response to a pathogen?
We've spoken at length previously about why mouse disease models are not great for human diseases every time and vice versa. So how does this strategy of vaccinating animals prevent pathogen transmission?
it's not just about the individual animal, it's about breaking the chain of transmission. So if you can stop the pathogen from circulating in the animal population, you reduce the chances of it ever spilling over into humans.
The ones that cause various diseases in humans, especially foodborne infections, actually live in chickens, and chickens really don't know they're there. That's a real problem because the chicken doesn't know it's there. What do we do? Chickens are vaccinated against salmonella, and the vaccines aren't brilliant at the moment. How can we design a vaccine such that chickens can go down the food chain and people can eat it safely and they don't get infected? Then, of course, COVID came along and I started to think about this much more.
How do you persuade people who fear that they may be being experimented on by the government to take the coronavirus vaccine?
Vaccine hesitancy has become a major issue, and it's so much based on trust.
The vaccine hesitancy thing was a real eye-opener to me. And so you go, well, okay, it's not going to be as easy as we roll out a vaccine, everybody takes it, job done. That's not the way the world is going to work anymore in a post-COVID world. We've got bird flu in birds. We can't vaccinate a wild population, but a lot of the way in which people come into contact with birds is in the birdhouse. Okay, so let's vaccinate people's backyard chickens, just for example, right? Let's see if we can do that, and then it won't jump across to people.
So bird flu, increasingly in the headlines. I mean, we're seeing it all over the place, like other zoonotic diseases such as Mpox. Is that cooked up fear or is it real?
Well, let's take, for example, bird flu on dairy farms in America. It jumped from birds into cows, and it's also jumped into cats. Some people have become infected too. So, what Claire was telling us is if you can vaccinate those cows, then you stop it in its tracks. And interestingly, we only seem to become concerned or fearful when it hits our wallets. So for bird flu, we suddenly look up and we pay attention because egg prices have gone through the roof and supply is low.
We're one mutation away from a bird flu pandemic. We know flu is very efficient at mutating, and we know that flu changes every year, right? People who work on bird flu have been warning for years that it's coming down the line. Mpox is also been very interesting. Okay, so Mpox has the particular challenge that we're not 100% certain where it came from. It seems to be in little squirrely things and various different rodents. We now have human-to-human transmission, which is clearly shown by the various populations in Africa and also in America and also in the UK. We had a small outbreak, and the virus again has mutated a bit, and the disease is more severe in parts of Africa, which is very concerning. The thing I'm concerned about too is the global inequality. Okay, it's going on in Africa, so it's not our problem, but meanwhile the pathogens are going, hey, we're happy, ignore us at your peril.
From Ebola to COVID-19 and now the rising threats of Mpox and other emerging infections, Africa has been at the forefront of zoonotic outbreaks. Yet time and again, when life-saving vaccines and treatments become available, they remain out of reach for many across the continent.
Yeah, and this is really frustrating. We've talked about this before in previous episodes. It's like these systemic barriers that are keeping African nations and their populations from accessing the medical tools that they need. It is just not right.
Right.
In my view, how the global south suffers. So most importantly, how does Claire think we can change this narrative?
Had we been rolled out the vaccines to various places in Africa, there's a chance we might not have got Omicron, because Omicron arose in South Africa, and the South Africans were brilliant, absolutely brilliant, because they told us about it. And because we knew about it, we were able to respond accordingly, but it was massively infectious. And so imagine Omicron had never emerged. My epidemiology friends tell me the rest of the pandemic would have been curtailed much sooner. And part of that was due to the vaccine inequality. It makes me concerned because, for example, America decided they don't want to be in the WHO anymore. And that, to my mind, I find that terrifying because the WHO is one of the organizations that globally watches what happens. And they need to be funded in order to do this work to protect all of us. Ebola, the Oxford group had actually managed to use their technology to generate a vaccine. We didn't get to the point where that had to be rolled out globally, but that's a terrifying virus. So far, we've survived a global pandemic with a pathogen that at least some people didn't die from.
This conversation reminded me of our conversation with Mustafa Bitaya, and Mustafa now is senior scientist working on diagnostic assay development at Medicine's Discovery Catapult. Previously worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the Jenner Institute, helping create the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID vaccine. So if you want to go re-listen to that episode, it is number 49 and we recommend it.
And I will plug another episode 80 here, on the cross-disciplinary science, because that comes up again. We had MIT's Professor Pete Didon and his team, or his colleagues actually, in Singapore, who discovered new compounds and different approaches to infectious diseases and antibiotic resistance. So let's get back to Claire. What does bringing all of these disciplines into a room together actually look like, and how long does it take?
I've worked with cross-disciplinary scientists for years, fantastic mathematicians and physicists and structural biologists and industry as well, actually. So all the kind of people that you want to bring together to try and think about how you would design a vaccine, how do you mobilise hospitals, how do you build your air systems, your ventilation, so that it's safe to prevent a respiratory pathogen coming through. There's challenges right the way from the top all the way down to the bottom, and bringing very senior politicians into the room is a challenge, but there's a whole bunch of super talented people, for example, in different aspects of the civil service and different aspects of government science, academic science and industry, that actually if you can identify the right individuals and get them to work together, it has to be a coalition of the willing who have a common goal, and that it's building the team that's the real challenge, actually.
When Bethany and I were speaking with Claire, we couldn't help but wonder what a dinner party at her house would be like, just taking on the world's problems and discussing and solving them.
Right, it's like 1 minute you're passing the wine and next you're rethinking global vaccine strategy or decoding zoonotic spillover.
Incredible.
My friend in maths is called Julia Gog, and my friend in physics is called Pietro Kikuta. And we used to sit together on a Friday afternoon with a cup of tea, and Julia would say to me, "Oh, Claire, so what happens when salmonella infects a cell?" And I said, "Well, Julia, this and this is supposed to happen, but I don't quite know whether it does. And in order to be able to answer that question, I need to be able to have a microscope, do this. And Pietro said, come back next week, I'll build it." We'd have such a lot of fun with those kind of circular questions. It's actually finding the right questions, which is a discipline you learn from a mathematician, and then thinking about the answers and then working out how to answer them. And those are the kind of disciplines that we've been learning. Dinner parties tend to be fun. If you fuel them with a glass of wine, then it gets even more fun.
And the one thing Claire, Julia, and Pietro didn't have at that dinner party was machine learning and enormous data sets. So COVID actually provided those enormous data sets. So now Claire has been thinking about how to incorporate DeepMind algorithms for AlphaFold to try and look at the model pathogen. There are even more tools in her armory now.
I think about how does a pathogen sit or hide, as we talked about earlier, and how does it avoid the immune system? When you were vaccinated against COVID, you produced antibodies. Antibodies prevented the spike protein binding onto the cells so it could get into the body. But what COVID did was it mutated so that it could try and avoid those antibodies and avoid the immune system. So it's leveraging those kind of data sets and trying to understand how a pathogen can hide, for me, but how a pathogen can evolve, and I'm thinking about a lot at the moment, is thinking about what are the right questions to ask and the right bite-sized pieces such that you can then train the models to answer those questions, and then can you interpret the data as it comes out. It's a massive and very interesting challenge.
It is not just about having data. What truly matters is how we use it. Proper training is the foundation of any successful data-based project. If we get that wrong, everything that follows can be misleading or even harmful.
Yeah, it's like, building a house on shaky ground. You might have the best materials, but if your foundation isn't right, the whole thing is unstable and falls down.
That's right. And with data, that foundation is how we train our models. What data did we feed them, how we clean it, how we validate the results. Missteps there can lead to flawed conclusions, and those can ripple out into real-world decisions.
One of the things that's assumed is that all databases are equal. As a veterinarian, I could probably cure a mouse of most of the diseases on the planet, frankly. We know quite a lot less about humans. Point number one is that we need to really develop serious databases to try and understand about the immune system and various genes in different animals in order to inform what we're doing and to really understand the basis of zoonotic disease. I need to understand what's happening to pathogens across the globe, and I need to understand how the human immune system, which is not the same. So most of our data comes from a certain cohort of people, but we need to understand globally the immune system and how that differs, how that then impacts on pathogens and their evolution, and then how we then manage to generate vaccines and drugs to interfere with those processes. only by having that kind of global understanding can we protect the planet. And that's from a human level and at an animal level.
So one of the most challenging dynamics during the pandemic, if you can remember that, or you don't have so much PTSD,
5+ years ago,
don't want to remember it.
Blacked it out.
It wasn't the virus itself, right? It was how quickly narratives formed around finger pointing and blame and so on.
And that kind of finger pointing can really derail global collaboration.
There was so much, in COVID, there was so much blame game. China got the blame, South Africa got the blame. I don't quite understand how Britain avoided getting the blame, actually, because we made a variant of COVID which went off, and the beta variant went off and caused problems, but somehow we managed to slip under the radar there because Omicron was so much worse. The blame game has to stop. We need the knowledge to make and understand and make the biological advances.
One thing the COVID pandemic really highlighted was how much we rely on data to make sense of uncertainty, but also how easy it is to misread or even misuse the data if we're not really careful.
And it's not just about numbers, it's about context, history, learning from past mistakes. And that is where we, human beings, often fall short.
One of the more interesting things during COVID was that we had access to a lot of online seminars, and I listened to a couple of people certainly talking about the history of AIDS, for example, a historian talking about the history of the plague, and realising that depressingly we still make the same mistakes and we need to learn our lessons from history, and that seems to be something we're not terribly good at.
Today, we discussed zoonotic pathogens and disease with the expert help of Dr. Clare Bryant.
And these nasty little pathogens can hide in animals without causing any obvious illness. And Claire's point is that if we can understand that better, we may be able to stop outbreaks before they start, maybe even by vaccinating those animals.
And it is about more than the science. Claire also talked about the social side, like vaccine hesitancy. So even with the best tools, if people do not trust the tools, we are stuck.
But kind of interesting to flip that. Okay, we won't vaccinate the people, we'll vaccinate the animals.
The animals.
So you get around some of the vaccine hesitancy, maybe. Not that we shouldn't, discourage that hesitancy. And anyway, Claire is super optimistic about the future. CRISPR-Cas9 and tools like mRNA vaccines are real game changers. But to really make progress, we need better global cooperation and more investment, of course, in understanding the animal immune systems, not just human immune systems.
Such a reminder that tackling infectious diseases is a global cross-species challenge.
Indeed. So now our regular spot every day is a school day.
And I want to switch it up this episode and do some book recommendations. It's so relevant to today's topic. Connor, you and I were recently at Saitiva's Senior Leader Summit, and we had a book club. So we exchanged nonfiction books with each other. And I am so passionate about a book that I left for our colleagues that I wanted to share that with our discoverers, our listeners of this podcast. So the book I left on the shelf was called An Immense World by Ed Yong. And I was first introduced to Ed Yong by listening to the Sunday Read on The Daily, another brilliant podcast. But in this book, Ed delves into the fascinating sensory experiences of animals. And it's not about dog years or 7 human years. There's no relation to the human experience. It's just purely the animal senses. And he's talking about echolocation in bats or ultraviolet vision of bees, the capacity of birds to sense magnetic fields. I mean, this is great. Another deep reference to Discovery Matters. He talks about what's special about cephalopods, just like we did on episode number 87. And I'm going to go on about this because this book is like, it is so good.
We will never ever know, in the words of Thomas Nagel, what it is like to be a bat, but this is a great book that might give you an insight, perhaps, into what it might be like, I guess.
Totally. And actually, Dream List, maybe Ed Yong would join us on this podcast one day. I mean, he is a science reporter. He became a birder during the pandemic, and he's just so... Also, his writing is so tight. I'm a huge admirer, and if you really want to learn something about the world, then read Ed Yong's book, An Immense World.
What was your book?
Thrilled by the book that I'm going to recommend here. And it's a book that I first read when I was 12, 13 years old. Believe it or not, it has, now I realize, it shaped a lot of how I think about art, science, technology, and the way all of these things interplay with each other. So some of you may well have read this book a long time ago. It is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig. And it's just a wonderful combination of father and son road trip with profound exploration of some philosophical and ethical questions, but using the science of motorcycle maintenance as a metaphor for how we approach life, technology, and problem solving. And you get this wonderful tension between kind of the rational and the scientific thinking, which we like to have as technologists and scientists, and then this intuitive, artistic experience. And it just asks you to think about what really is, the nature of good quality, and how do these combined ideas shape our understanding of the world. So if you're interested in science and values and personal growth, there's also a focus of kind of mindfulness and curiosity. It's just a wonderful book about the philosophy of science, the art of troubleshooting, and it's just a great read full of really good stories and great characters.
Okay. Our producer is Bethany Armit Brewster, editing, mixing, and supervision by Tom Henley. My name is Dodie Axelson.
And I'm Connor McKeffney. Make sure you rate us on Spotify or whichever podcast platform you use to listen to us. We'll see you when we come back with another episode of Discovery Matters.